Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Williams, and I am a professor in the School of History at UCC, and I'm also head of the College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences here. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome delegates to this online conference on Terence MacSwiney, Cork Men's Jail, and the Political Hunger Strike 1920 to 2020. I'd particularly like to welcome colleagues who are joining us from Goettingen, from the United States, from India, England, Scotland, Belfast, Dublin, Limerick, Maynooth and Galway. We were just chatting before the beginning there, and we would very much like to have welcomed you to Cork and to UCC in person. We had extensive plans for hospitality that we've had to put on hold, but we hope that it'll be possible for those of you who've not visited us here in UCC before to join us on another occasion in due course. The conference has been organised by my colleagues Dr. John Borgonovo of the School of History and Dr. Sean Lucy, who is a historian. He's currently exiled in the College of Business and Law. And my sincere thanks to them and to Cork City Council and to the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gael for supporting this really important event. One of my responsibilities in the university is to chair the President's Working Group on Commemorations, and that includes responsibility for what we do in UCC to mark the last phases of the decade of centenaries. And I can tell you that we're going to host in June 2022 the Irish Civil War National Conference here in UCC, working with the department on that occasion as well. And my colleagues John Borgonovo and Dr. Mervyn O'Driscoll, the head of the School of History, have been very much to the fore in preparing for that important event. One of the core principles set out by the Expert Advisory Group on Commemorations has been to encourage multiple and plural perspectives on complex and contested events. And this is true as much of this three-day conference that we're launching this afternoon on the Political Hunger Strike as it is of the Civil War Conference. Over the next 3 days, we're going to focus on the specifics of the cases of Lord Mayor Terence MacSwiney and of his fellow Republicans Michael Fitzgerald and Joseph Murphy. But it's clear that the Cork Hunger Strike and MacSwiney's death in Brixton Prison was seen at the time and needs to be seen now in a global and comparative context. One of the papers this afternoon is going to tell us more about the hunger strike tactic deployed by the Women's Social and Political Union before the First World War. And we know that both suffragettes and Irish Republicans such as Tomás Ashe were subjected to force feeding, which is the subject of other investigations in today's sessions. Of course, hunger strikes were deployed in other contexts around the world. We have papers on the use of the tactic by Gandhi in resisting British power in India, and on how the MacSwiney episode was viewed and understood beyond Ireland itself. Other papers will consider the hunger strike weapon from a variety of perspectives: the psychiatric, the legal, the memorialization and creative interpretation of strikers and their stories, and the impact of the events of 1920 on Republican approaches to conflict. Most of the papers we will be hearing will be delivered as part of panels, but we also have a couple of plenaries, beginning later this afternoon with Dr. Ciara Brennach from the University of Limerick, who will be speaking on prison medical officers and hunger strikers, and ending on Saturday with Dr. Will Murphy of DCU, putting the Brixton and Cork hunger strikers in context. And we have time built in both for more freewheeling discussions, such as the one on the Irish language today, and the conversation that will follow about contemporary museum exhibitions and documentary films. An online conference is a different kind of beast, of course, from one that would be held physically on site. There isn't quite the same opportunity for interaction outside the plenaries and the panels, but we'll be doing our best to facilitate as much discussion and interaction as possible, notwithstanding the limitations of the format. So I'm going to hand over in just a moment to Dr. John Borgonovo, who's going to talk us through some of the housekeeping and the sort of rules by which we'll operate over the next 3 days. But again, can I just welcome you to this? I really appreciate people having taken the time and trouble in what has been for many of us, a frantically busy period to have contributed ideas and papers to this conference. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the outcomes, the research, and the contexts in which we can place the events of 1920. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much for your support. And thank everybody who's tuning in now from points out in Cork and outside of Cork and across the world. So you're very welcome. I'm John Borgonovo. I'll be kind of hosting a fair bit of the proceedings over the next 3 days. I'm going to just give you a few housekeeping rules. First of all, I want to introduce you to our event conference management dynamic duo, Gene O'Callahan and Michael Keneally. If you guys want to, are you guys going to show yourselves? Yes, excellent. They are, besides giving tremendous support and expertise, they'll also be kind of on standby in case we run into any issues during the proceedings. And if you need to, if you're having technical difficulties, you can address a private chat to them and from the chat function at Zoom, and hopefully they'll be able to resolve that. So one of the important things we want to make sure is that everybody who's participating or everybody who's tuning in to just make sure that your video and audio are muted. That's important. We will be running through kind of each session. They'll have a chair who will be responsible for that session. We'll have, each of the sessions will have a Q&A component at the end. And what we're going to ask you to do is to send in type in your questions in the chat function. And we will try to get to those at the end of the session. And again, we'll have 5 or 10, 15 minutes at the end of each sessions for questions. Not all the questions will be answered, but we'll make an effort to get through as many as we can. Please note that this meeting and these proceedings are being recorded, just so you know. And then finally, a number of our speakers are new to Zoom. This is kind of an evolving expertise for academics and everybody, I guess. So we're going to anticipate having a few hiccups and maybe even a few technical difficulties. Just bear with us. We'll try to resolve things quickly. Again, we're kind of blessed in having folks on site who are going to help in Gene and Michael, who are going to hopefully help us manage that. But there will be hiccups along the way, so just bear with us as much as you can. So I am, just to give you a quick rundown of today's proceedings. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Helene O'Keefe in a moment. That'll be followed by a 10-minute break. And then starting at 3:10, we'll have our plenary by Dr. Kira Brownlock. Again, as Chris said about her talk on prison medical officers, and that session will run for about an hour. We'll have another break, and then we'll have a panel discussion in Irish, which will discuss kind of Terence MacSwiney and the language, chaired and kind of player coached by Dr. Niall Buttimer. And then finally, we'll close out today's proceedings with a discussion with curators at the Crawford Art Gallery, Cork Public Museum, and the filmmaker Ciara Hyland, who will talk about some different initiatives. And then tomorrow we'll be proceeding from 12 until about 6 o'clock, and the same is true with Saturday's proceedings as well. And there should be a schedule on the conference registration page available for you. But I think it's about time for me to hand over to today's chair for this first session, and that's Dr. Helene O'Keefe. She is a historian and a research fellow at the School of History, University College Cork. She's also the digital projects manager with the Atlas of the Irish Revolution project, and she's going to take you through today's first session and the papers that are going to ensue. So I'm going to hand it over to Helene O'Keefe. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Welcome Sorry. Welcome to the first panel in our conference today. And I'm delighted to welcome 4 great speakers who will be able to provide you with some really valuable context and background to the papers that are going to follow over the next 3 days. So as John said, we're going to have 4 speakers today. Each one will speak for 20 minutes. And at the end of the session, after which all 4 speakers will have presented their papers, we're going to turn then to your own questions. So if you would like to participate during the papers by using the chat function, just to pose your questions, we'll collect those at the end and pose them then to our speakers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker this afternoon. I know she'll forgive my appalling pronunciation, but here it goes. Heidrun Mühlbradt from the University of Goettingen. And she's going to be speaking to us today on a paper entitled The Global Laboratory Going on Hunger Strike. Some very quick biographical notes on Heidrun before she begins. She is currently undertaking her PhD at the University of Goettingen. It is entitled Body Revolutions, How the Body Initiated, Shaped and Transformed the Irish, 1916 to 23, and German Revolution, 18 to 23. Her aim is to show that the body as the place of experience and perception was the driving force behind the Irish and German Revolution, while ideology was merely its effect, a retrospective ontologizing explanation of what had already happened. By building on ethno-methodological, phenomenological, and praxeological methodologies and theories, she will work towards a synthesis of social, political, and cultural historical approaches. She will start at the interface between 1, discursively and ideologically shaped body concepts, 2, the body as a social, cultural, and political signifier, and 3, the body as a source of meaning and agency. So it's great pleasure I introduce to you our first speaker, Heidrun Mühlbradt. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I hope you can see and hear me. At first, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to present my paper and also a little bit of my research at this conference. In my talk, I read Ireland shortly before and during the Irish War of Independence as a global laboratory in which the political weapon of hunger striking was transformed from a particular female form of suffering into a male form of national resistance. So drawing on a wide range of source materials, I will trace back how over the English suffragettes, hunger striking and forced meal feeding were implemented into Ireland's inventory of social practices, only to be translated into heroic male martyrdom. I would argue that the Irish hunger strike epitomized the Irish triad of hegemonic masculinity, Christianity, and nationalism. But let's start at the beginning, namely with the hunger strike of the English suffragettes. When 3 members of the militant women's suffrage associations, Women's Social and Political Union, Mary Lee, Gladys Evans, and Jenny Baines went on hunger strike in Mountjoy prison in Dublin on 40th August 1912, they imported a political weapon to Ireland that should have a long-lasting impact on this country. The hunger strike, epitomized by Tomás, Terence, MacSwiney, and Bobby Sands, became Ireland's most spectacular form of national resistance in the 20th century. And it all started out with 3 English suffragettes who were responsible for throwing a hatchet at the carriage of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, as well as for a failed arson attack on the Theatre Royal Dublin. The hunger strike of the WSPU members should only began to gain the status of political prisoners, were only little sparks that light up the fire. 4 members of the Irish Women's Franchise League, who were also imprisoned at Mountjoy and had been occupied with the idea of going on hunger strike for a considerable amount of time, joined the hunger protest with slight delays. 4 other imprisoned IDFL women did not join, 2 because of their poor health and the other 2 because they refused. Even though most Irish historians have preferred to seek the roots of hunger strike in Ireland or India, their origin can be clearly traced back to the women's suffrage movement in England. Some historians have recognized the suffragettes' legacy, yet comprehended the early Irish hunger strikes as the result of an appropriation and execution of an idea rather than practices undergoing a complex imitation process. Of course, we can buy a history of ideas and trace hunger striking back to Russian prison protests in the 19th century, or to ancient forms of fasting in Ireland or India, but all this cannot blind us to the fact that it was the suffragettes who brought hunger striking and forcible feeding to Ireland, as a practice, not as an idea. So what might look like the idea of hunger striking was in fact the effect of the practice of hunger striking. The hunger strike of the WSPU prisoners should be the acid test for Ireland's prison authorities. On 19th August 1912, the IWFL hunger strikers had completed their sentences and were released along with the English suffragette Jenny Baines, whose health was too frail to remain in prison. One day later, the Irish prison authorities began to forcibly feed the English suffragettes Mary and Gladys Evans. In the writing on the forcible feeding of the suffragettes, it has been suggested that the Irish authorities had waited for the release of the Irish hunger strikers to avoid creating the public furor if Irish women were known to be undergoing forcible feeding. Murphy has pointed out that the medical practice in Mountjoy prison did not comply with the norm in England and Scotland to begin forcible feeding within 2 or 3 days of commencement of a strike. Yet we should not overinterpret the decision to wait on the release of the Irish prisoners as a political maneuver by the Irish authorities. In fact, it was not unusual for the General Prisons Board, which was responsible for managing the Irish prison system, to postpone forcible feeding as long as possible. So when the English suffragette Gladys Evans was re-arrested on the 22nd October and refused her food, it was decided that forcible feeding had to be resorted to after her appearing in court on the 29th of October. As she was discharged, forcible feeding did not take place during her second arrest. In Northern Ireland, the prison authorities later used the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act 1913, according to which prisoners on hunger strike were to be released from prison as soon as they became ill and could be re-imprisoned after recovery on their little charges to permanently release hunger striking suffragettes regardless of the crime they had committed. So it is more appropriate to say that the decision to forcibly feed hunger striking prisoners was hanging like the sword of Damocles over the Irish prison authorities. The medical officers at Mountjoy were well aware that they had to conduct forcible feeding. Yet as the General Prisons Board was most reluctant to forcibly feed female prisoners, it postponed the decision on whether a patient should undergo forcible feeding in order to wait for the problem to resolve itself. The prisoner might give in or be released discharged. Only when postponing the decision on whether a patient should undergo forcible feeding became too great a burden, the General Prisons Board faced the problem by seeking advice from outside the board, an expectation to be provided with an incentive to find a cat with red. In contrast to the rather positivistic and order-based approach to forcible feeding in Great Britain, which involved following an unwritten schedule of beginning forcible feeding within 2 or 3 days of commencement of a strike, the Irish prison authorities procrastinated forcible feeding as long as possible in order to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. While the English and Scottish approach aims to make sense through the concept of law and order, which means implementing forcible feeding in the Irish prison system or in the prison system by mirroring legal frameworks and administrative practices one-to-one, the decision-making process of the General Prisons Board can best described as a collective construction of the beliefs in being forced into making decisions and in having no alternative other than to introduce forcible feeding. As one letter clearly indicates, the General Prisons Board had taken into consideration that the English suffragette Mary might go on hunger strike in Mountjoy prison. She was one of the first English suffragettes to undergo forcible feeding and known for giving the prison authorities much trouble by barricading her doors and smashing windows. Expecting the worst, the medical officer in Mountjoy made timely preparation for being able to forcibly feed her and contacted Birmingham prison on the 27th of July in order to obtain further information on the former prisoner Mary, which would quite guide him in his treatment of her. Along with a detailed report on these former experiences with forcible feeding, the responsive medical officer at Birmingham had added some personal instructions on how to conduct forcible feeding in prison, which proved most helpful for the Irish authorities. So in terms of frequency, method of procedure, and composition of the diet, forcible feeding in Mountjoy was aligned with the personal instructions of the medical officer at Birmingham prison. So unlike Gladys Evans, who did not resist and was fed by esophageal tube passed through the mouth, Mary was loosely strapped to the feeding chair in view of a violent resistance in Birmingham prison. and she was fed by nasal tube. Forcible feeding continued until lives of the English suffragettes were at stake. Lee had to be released on the 20th of September because her life was in danger, and even on the 3rd of October because she was close to a general breakdown. In contrast to the English prison authorities, firstly struggled to find an adequate answer to the first hunger strikes in 1999, that released several prisoners to avoid female martyrs, the Irish prison authorities could directly build on the experience of English prisons. So long before the English suffragettes went on hunger strike, the prison authorities in Ireland had an answer to their resistance, which they could implement into the Irish prison system. In contrast to their male Irish hungers who adopted their form of resistance, the English suffragettes actively and violently defended their bodies against the execution of artificial feeding, so that it had to be performed in them as forcible feeding. The most distinctive characteristic of the suffragettes' hunger strike was that their political resistance was primarily embodied in the violent defense of their bodies against the execution of artificial feeding, and not in their refusal of food, as one might assume. Initially, the hunger strike was described as the most terrible weapon of political prisoners, and as a mightier weapon than those of all the opposing army, while the hunger striker was praised for determination and characteristic heroism. Yet with the introduction of forcible feeding, the hunger strike itself increasingly lost its importance and became a means to an end, namely a means to provoke a violent government response, which would serve as evidence for the violent repression of women in England. The WSPU hunger strikers compared forcible feeding to torture and described in detail the brutality and cruelty of the prison staff, the pain they had suffered during and after the forcible feeding. They gendered the practice and experience of forcible feeding in such a way that the written accounts, propaganda posters, and political agitation reproduced patriarchal gender roles and primarily target men, a cardinal sin for a women's suffrage movement. When the suffragettes displayed their suffering, precisely described how painful the experience of forcible feeding was, and images of gagged and strapped women overshadowed the power of their hunger strike. The militant suffrage movement did not offer women an inspiring role model, that they completely gave up their agency in favor of becoming a passive victim to be rescued by male cavaliers. Beautiful young women depicted as helpless, weak, and being tortured in prison adorned the propaganda posters with which men rather than women could be mobilized. British members of parliament came to the rescue when condemning Russian barbarism in English prisons, announcing that they could not denounce torture in Russia and support in England. The suffragettes primarily target male nationalists with their political campaign against forcible feeding in English prisons. When the suffragettes built on the concept of the violated female body and precisely described their physical wounds and the great pain they had gone through, they symbolically emasculated the English government. The bleeding and swollen mouths, the broken beings, the horrible pain in the throat and breast, and the cries and deep moans did not only make the ill treatment in prison visible, but also reproduced patriarchal gender roles according to which masculinity was linked to the ability to protect and defend the female body. So the suffragettes ended up in a vicious cycle in which the right to vote was deemed an achievement that could be awarded by male judges who were supposed to set the terms. Accordingly, the British government mastered to turn forcible feeding into a political weapon with which they could neutralize the hunger strikes, put the suffragettes on the defensive, as well as set the terms of the prison battle, while the suffragettes were forced to find evidence for the pain, for the brutality of the prison staff, and for the dangerousness of forcible feeding. Although the English suffragettes formed the breeding ground for their successors, it was the Irish hunger strikers who succeeded in fully exploiting the potential of the political hunger strike. Unlike the suffragettes who openly displayed their suffering and the pain they had gone through, the Irish hunger strikers built on the concept of heroic masculinity when they presented themselves as martyrs prepared to take the consequences and to die in a good cause. They even dismissed the experience of being forcibly fed as something rather most unpleasant than painful. Hunger and cold seemed to have no effect on the men's spirits, as they all remained as gay and aggressive as on the first day. They found no difficulty at all in refusing food or drink, despite the fact that they could clearly feel the effects such as skin coming off their lips. According to the Evening Guard report, one hunger striker let the prison guards know that the feeding wasn't near as bad as they thought. The hunger striker Thomas was described as most uncomplaining. Tim Healy appeared for the who appeared for the Ashe family at the inquest to investigate his death, described him as follows: "Heroes and soldiers don't make complaints." When the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSwiney, hunger striked himself to death on the 25th of October 1920, he formed the sad climax of Irish hunger striking as a political weapon and became the personification of Irish martyrdom under British rule. Heroic masculinity meant to suffer in silence and to endure every form of punishment and humiliation without complaining and whining. So the Irish hunger death derived from an essentially anthropocentric worldview, according to which every society is constituted from the sacrifices men make for the society. So hegemonic masculinity found its expression in the ability to stoically endure every form of corporeal punishment, as best symbolized in the suffering, crucifixion, and redemptive death of Jesus Christ, as well as in the ancient archetypes Atlas, carrying the burden of the heavens on his shoulders, and Prometheus, whose liver is daily eaten by an eagle as his eternal punishment for the creation of mankind and culture. So fitting these hegemonic ideals of manhood put considerable pressure on men, who are often tormented by feeling of guilt. According to one of his former comrades, the surrender of arms in Cork during Easter week had weighed a good deal on Terence MacSwiney's mind, so that his hunger strike to death was an opportunity to blot out the bitterness of Easter week. In the broader context of the construction of identity and the formation of social groups, their feelings of guilt are to be read as the attempt to conform with hegemonic ideas of manhood, which involved making certain sacrifices for Ireland, contributing to the cause, and not letting the comrades down. The quoting Jim Larkin, Shakespeare, and the Pope, Sean O'Casey emphasized that Thomas Ashe was a man with a hero's heart, who played a soldier's part. Praised for his glorious manhood, for gaining the martyr's crown, and for having died with a hero's smile, Thomas Ashe's death perfectly epitomized the Irish triad of hegemonic masculinity, Christianity, and nationalism. As human phoenixes, the political importance of Thomas Ashe and Terence MacSwiney was reflected in the courage to dare and in their heroic sacrifice to have laid down their lives so that their fellow countrymen could arise out of the ashes. In the Christian as well as Irish nationalist symbol of the phoenix, the two concepts of being, that is life, and nothingness, death, were sublated in the concept of becoming. Becoming is rising or resurrection. So this three-step dialectic principle describes how the Irish hunger strikers, as well as the Irish nationalist contemporaries, comprehended, experienced, and interpreted the Irish hunger strikes. So when Terence MacSwiney was described as the most glorious martyr, and his death as the most heroic individual sacrifice for Ireland in all of her glorious history, his hunger death was read as a good death because the concept of death, in its dialectic interplay with the concept of life, was preserved and changed through sublation in the concept of becoming. Accordingly, interpreting the Irish hunger death as dead faces laugh, aimed to emphasize the importance of the negative in history, namely suffering, death, and war. And I would say Hegel, as this is based on Hegel, and I would say Hegel does exactly this. In contrast to any suicidal nihilism, according to Nietzsche, the Irish hunger strikers made sense of suffering and death. Normally, suicide doesn't make sense, for example. So we can ask, is this really a form of suicide? I would suggest it is not, because it actually makes sense, unlike suicide, or in Nietzsche's words, suicidal nihilism. Where the prison authorities and the British government could downplay the suffragettes' experience of forcible feeding as exaggerating allegations by historical women whose suffering was self-inflicted and worsened by their resistance. These arguments could do little to discredit the Irish hunger strikers, as they did not complain and often did not resist. Furthermore, self-inflicted martyrdom might only have proved their capacity to suffer, their courage and their willpower, because martyrdom is all about dying in a good cause. So I would like to come to the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Heidrun, for opening our conference with such an interesting paper. comparisons between the representation and interpretation of the suffrage hunger strikes in contrast to the Republican hunger strikes some years later. Really, really interesting. And again, I'd like to encourage any of those of you who are watching to just submit any questions you might have for Heidrun, and we can pose them to the speakers then at the end. Thank you again so much. Thank you also for sticking rigidly to your 20-minute time slot. Much appreciated. Moving on to our second speaker in today's panel, our second of four. I'm delighted to introduce to you Meadhbh from the University College in Dublin, and she's going to be presenting a paper to you entitled The Force in Force Feeding. So before I welcome her to the Zoom conference forum, I'd just like to present to you a quick biography first. So Meadhbh is an archivist in University College Dublin. She is the manager of the UCD Cultural Heritage Collections blog, liaising with various different cultural heritage units. That blog won the Best in the Arts Culture category in the Irish Blog Awards in 2018. She is currently undertaking her PhD part-time in UCD Centre of History of Medicine in Ireland, looking at the relationship between surgeon anatomists and animals in the 18th and 19th century. So I am delighted to welcome to you today Meadhbh, who will be speaking to you on the force in force feeding. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Thank you again for letting me talk today at this conference. I'm afraid I'm one of those people John said is kind of a first timer on Zoom, so hopefully I'll be able to transition into my slides quite easily, but please do bear with me. So as Helena said there, I'm in UCD Archives, and I have an unpleasant but I think a necessary talk for you today, and that's going to be on the clinical procedures and the variety of instruments that were available to physicians at the time of Tomás and, in this particular case, Terence MacSwiney's hunger strike. Now, anybody who would be interested in Irish history would have known and would have heard of the term forcibly feeding an individual or force feeding of individuals. And I think it's one that we can kind of bandy about a bit, but we don't actually know the ins and outs of it. And I think once we do that, and I hope this talk will do that, I think we'll better be able to understand the hardship and the trauma, both physical and mental, that the individuals, and in this case, Irish political prisoners, went through when they decided to go on hunger strike and then were subjected to be force-fed. So the individuals that were subjected to force feeding, it was obviously political prisoners, which is kind of what we're focusing on today, but it was also patients in hospitals. So say they didn't have the faculties after surgery, or if they were in a mental institute, they mightn't be able to actually feed themselves. So that's how they were force fed. And then, as Heidrun said there, like the suffragettes also used it as a way to kind of show, like make their case made to the public of the lack of women's rights, and they were able to use it as a tool to kind of get those human rights and that ball rolling. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with a little bit of where the history of force feeding came from, and then I'll look at the actual clinical procedures and the instruments available to physicians at the time of the 1910s. Now, I do have to kind of put in a disclaimer here. It's not an easy listen. It's not an easy visual thing, but I will just literally clinically go through the different stages and the different variety, instruments that were available to the physicians to use. So first, the first introduction of force feeding was in asylums, as they were called then, in the 1790s. And it was initially to deal with patients who would not be able to or refused to actually take in nourishment. And an example of this would be the fasting girls. Now, the fasting girls were a group of girls who claimed that they could survive for extended periods of time without any nourishment at all. It was their religious beliefs that helped them to survive. And at first, that was originally viewed as a great strength to have, you know, such a strong faith and belief in your religion. But then gradually, as time went on, the medical and religious world began to separate, and then it was seen more as psychologically unstable, and that the girls couldn't make the decision to feed themselves. So that's where the idea then that they would be force-fed to keep them alive, regardless of what their belief and kind of understanding was at the time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my slides with you, and then we continue on through the talk. So bear with me 1 second. So the first person to kind of introduce and pioneer force feeding was the image you see on the left there, Philippe Pinel. He was a French psychiatrist, and he began feeding his patients in an asylum with an elastic tubing in the 1790s. Now, as the need for specialized instruments grew, surgeons and physicians adapted the instruments available to better suit their needs. And by 1868, we have Adolf Cosmo, who was a German physician, and he actually had developed and introduced the stomach tube at this stage. So by the early 90s, again, the instruments have developed according to the needs of the physicians at the time, and a large variety of instruments were available to medical officers to use on patients. And what we're going to do is I'm going to look at a medical instrument catalogue that would have been available around the time of Thomas Ashe and Terence MacSwiney's imprisonment. It's actually called the Catalogue of Surgical Instruments and Appliances, and it was produced by the Down brothers in London, and it's from 1906. So that's going to be my point of reference to show you the instruments that were available at the time. So now I'm just going to take you through the step-by-step procedure of what you would do if you're going to try and force feed an individual. Again, it's not an easy talk, but I do think it's a necessary one. So to start with, your patient or prisoner was unwilling. It was not something that they wanted to happen to them. It's not a nice procedure. And the natural reaction is to struggle and resist against this procedure. So because of this, restraints were needed to stop the individual from moving. The more they moved, the more damage could be done by the physician as they tried to force feed them. So you wanted to restrain them. So you could do this in a number of ways. One way was by using actual individuals, assistants to help you. And you can see here in the two images that you've got people holding down the man on the left on the ground, or there's the image of the suffragette being held in the chair. Now, if you didn't have the personnel to do that, you would be able to procure a restraining chair, which would have straps and stuff built onto it, and the person would sit in the chair and they'd be restrained by the straps on their ankles and wrists in the chair. If you didn't have a chair either, you were able to actually order different types of kind of more mobile restraints, so you would be able as a physician to take them from hospital or asylum with you. And again, this is just to give you a variety of the different ones available from the Downs catalogue in 1906. So you see the top left, you've got one that would go around your waist, and then the kind of pear-shaped leather patches is where the individual's hands would have been kind of strapped up and restrained. And then you have the ankle straps, which then have belts to go around, say, the bottom, the feet of a chair, or the leg of, or the end of a bed. And it's the same with the other ones. It really is just difference in variety or different needs by the physician of which one that they would actually use themselves. The one on the right is obviously a bit more kind of comprehensive. It has restraints available for the shoulders, for the body, and also for the ankles. So it's just to give you an idea of what kind of restraints were available. Then the decision had to be made, would you feed the individual either through the mouth or through the nose? And if you're going to go through the mouth, what you had to do was you had to get the mouth open, It had to be kept open, and that was to enable the tube to be fed in down the throat and hopefully into the stomach. So you had to have the person's mouth open for the duration of the procedure. Again, to open the mouth, there was a variety of instruments available to physicians. So here we have different mouth wedges, as they're termed in the catalogue. And again, it's just the different types available, and probably different ones that would be used by physicians in different circumstances. So you've got one there on the top left that looks like a kind of drill, and you would use that, turn it to open the person's mouth fully. And then you also have one on the top right, which could be put onto the end of the finger and pushed into the person's mouth to open their mouth. You've got a bit more mechanical ones there, and the two on the right as well, the screw wedge, which there you turn the key and it would open the person's mouth regardless of how much they struggled. So once you have the mouth open, you want to keep it open, and a way of doing that is by using mouth gags. And again, this is just a variety that was available. So these would go onto the side of the person's mouth, and then they would use a kind of ratchet system that it would open the mouth to a certain point and then lock. So it didn't matter, again, how much pressure was put on them, they would keep the mouth open, and you know, it would be then able for the physician to use the tubing to go in and down into the mouth. I do want to point out that there's one here on the bottom right that says that there is sizes available in both adult and children. So it would have been the case, I presume, that that would have been, say, for example, the fasting girls, that's where that would have been used. But it's just to note that there are different sizes available at the time. Here's an illustration just to show you what that would have looked like on the side of the person's mouth. And again, it just gives you a good idea that it would be used to keep the person's mouth open, and it would stop, it would jam so that the person couldn't actually close their mouth anymore. We also have another one that was designed and developed particularly for this procedure by a physician. And as you can see here, this is the William Cox mouth gag. And it was used to help open the patient's mouth and keep it open. And it actually explains there in the text how it would do that. It had a rack catch action which fixes automatically, so that the mouth would stay open and it would be locked open, say. And I just want to again point out where it says in the very bottom that irrespective of the amount of pressure which is being put onto the toothpaste, this would stay open. So again, it's been developed by a physician for a particular purpose. The next slide, again, this is just to show you, these are probably a bit more heavy duty. These ones would actually go around the back of the head and onto the side of the mouth and hold the mouth open. We've got here the differences. You've got tongue depressors. So this is the thing at the front that would go onto the chin and keep the tongue down out of the way so that the tubing could be inserted. Again, we've got a developed and designed instrument specifically for force feeding, and that's the Blanford's forcible feeding tube for lunatics. And this just highlights again that if you have a lack of personnel, this was able to use with the individual, and the physician could use this because of the T-bar that would go where the teeth would be, and it would keep the teeth away and open enough for the tubing to go in and down, hopefully into the individual's stomach. Now that was, if the decision was made to go to the mouth, they're all useful to the physician. If it was to the nose, you didn't need a mouth wedge, you didn't need a mouth gag. You would just put the tubing up the nasal cavity, down the back of the throat, and hopefully into the stomach. And the tubing that was available to you at the time was in a variety of different substances. So here on the left, you have different substances, different sizes. You've silk web, elastic gum, Indian rubber. And then here on the right, you actually have one of the instruments that could be used to put the tubing down into the person's stomach. And you've got it illustrated there on the right, how that could be done. I do find that illustration a bit odd, because unless you can see or have x-ray vision into the patient's throat, throat and esophagus, you can't see where the tubing is going, and that's why it's a lot of the time forced and it can go into the wrong place, such as the lungs. So even though the illustration is great probably to sell the instrument, it doesn't help when you're actually trying to carry out the procedure. Now, some tubing came with their own inbuilt mouth guards, and you can see here on the left, you've got the T-bar there to use to keep the teeth away from the tubing. You've also got inbuilt funnels, so the funnel would be used just to raise above the physician's head, pour the mixture in, and again, gravity would push it down the tubing and into the individual's stomach. We also have an instrument that was in the Downs catalogue that we today would associate with emptying a person's stomach, where in 1906 it was actually used to pump food mixture into the person's stomach, and that's the stomach pump. So here we have an illustration of how it would have been used, and the mixture would have been drawn up through the pipe in the middle and then actually pushed with the lever there, with the push action into the tubing and then down into the person's stomach. So once the individual has been successfully, and I use quotes on that, fed, the tubing was removed and the procedure was over. Now that all sounds very straightforward, but there were many, many difficulties associated with forcibly feeding an individual. It's not a procedure that was willingly undertaken, as I said at the beginning. The individual will struggle. The body itself will resist and reject what is happening to it. The physical damage that's done to the nose and the mouth as points of entry to try and put the tubing in. And sometimes the tubing had to be put in numerous times because it wouldn't be able to go in. It would get stuck, there'd be resistance, and it would be taken back out and tried again. When the tubing was inserted into the stomach, the body naturally rejects such a foreign item going into the stomach, and that would lead to intense vomiting throughout the procedure. So again, you have this natural reaction and struggle to what is happening to the individual. The tubing can go down into the lungs, which of course is serious damage to the respiratory system. And not only that, it can cause a sensation of drowning for the individual as well. So mentally that would have huge impact on the patient or prisoner. The force being used to insert the tube can cause internal damage as well. It's not going to go easily down into the stomach. It will meet resistance on the way down, and it is then forced down. So from the point of entry all the way down, it can cause huge damage just from the tubing alone on the person's internal organs. And it can manifest irreparable damage in the circulatory, respiratory, digestive, and nervous systems. But of course, there's also the immeasurable damage that can be done to the individual's mental health. So knowing that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you struggle, no matter how hard you resist, this procedure will be forced on you, can have huge effect on the individual. And sometimes it's not even the procedure itself, it can be the threat of the procedure that can have a huge impact on an individual. And here I'm going to just highlight in Annie MacSwiney's diary from the week of Terence MacSwiney, leading up to the Terence MacSwiney's death in October 1920. Now we have here in UCD both Mary and Terence MacSwiney's papers, which I know are going to be used extensively through this conference. So I'm just going to touch lightly on them here just to emphasize that kind of the strain on the mental health of an individual from the idea of being force-fed. So in Annie MacSwiney's diary, she actually notes on Tuesday, the 19th of October, that Terence's eyes looked excited and he was evidently very disturbed mentally. And the reason she gives this for happening is that Dr. Griffiths had attacked him in the morning and said he would make, and she underlines make here, make him take the lime juice. So Terence was well aware, I'm just going to come out of this now so you can see me again. So Terence was well aware of the effects of force feeding, especially because Tomás Ashe, as Heidrun had touched on earlier, he had been in a weakened state when he was force-fed, and he died from the results of being force-fed. So Terence would have known this, and he himself was in a weakened state. So it's it just highlights that it's not only the physical, it can be the mental damage that the procedure of force feeding can do. So to finish, I hope I've given you a better, maybe an unwanted, because it's not a nice process, understanding of the clinical procedure to force feed an individual at the time of Terence MacSwiney's imprisonment, and how that can physically and mentally damage the individual. And unfortunately, it can still do the same today. But I hope by having a background to what it takes to force feed someone, we can all better understand the sacrifice that was made by people like Tomás and Terence MacSwiney when they took on the idea of going on hunger strike. And that's my finish to that talk. Thank you very much.
Dave, thank you so much for adding to this valuable first panel, which is going to give us some really important context for the 3 days of the conference that follows, as you said. Not easy, certainly listening, but as you say, quite necessary. Definitely an interesting grounding for us there. Okay, we are going to move on to the third of this panel's 3 speakers, or 4 speakers rather. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Tomás Conmara from University College Cork. And he will be presenting a paper on the Mountjoy Hunger Strike of 1917 and its effect on later hunger strikes. So again, just before Tomás comes to the forum, I'm going to give you a brief background and biography. So Dr. Tomás Conmara is a folklorist and oral historian attached to the Department of Folklore and Ethnology in UCC, where he manages the Cork Folklore Project. As a historian, he is best known for his work on revolutionary Clare, which include the monographs, The Time of the Tans, An Oral History of the War of Independence in County Clare, Days of Hunger, The Clare Volunteers and the Mountjoy Hunger Strikers of 1917, and Patrick Brennan's autograph book, an Irish rebel autograph book from Fronguk internment camp in 1916. So without further ado, Dr. Tomás Conmara. Is he there?
Yeah.
Do we have him?
Yeah, here.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to retreat, Tomás, and
No bother. Thank you very much, Elaine. I appreciate that. Thanks for that. Look, before I start the Slido, and say it's more of a presentation rather than a paper, but just to brief you out what I'm going to try and touch on today. I think obviously to try and understand the significance of Terence MacSwiney's hunger strike, we have to consider what happened beforehand, and Tomás has been mentioned a number of times in both of his papers. So what I'm going to try and do is reflect on the Mountjoy Hunger Strike of 1917 to look at how that evolved, how it came to be, and to consider the introduction at that time of hunger striking in a Republican context. I'm also going to try and look at the difference between the effectiveness of hunger striking as a political weapon and death on a hunger strike, which I think moves it on to an entirely different level. And in that context, the thing I'm going to look at is the martyrdom of Tomás and the significance of that in terms of its impact on the contemporary political environment in 1917 as an example for what happens in the 1920 experience of Terence MacSwiney and of course of Joe Murphy and of Mick Fitzgerald as well. And I think it's important, first of all, in terms of talking about 1917, that I make the case that I think the hunger strike in 1917, in particular the death of Tomás is actually more significant, or at least you can make, I make the argument that it's more significant in terms of its impact on political consciousness than the Easter Rising of 1916. And while that might sound like a significant statement, I think it's supportable, because you're a year and a half out from Easter Rising. The Irish public have become much more aware of separatism as a notion. The whole idea of Irish independence is a much more understood and accepted part of a public discourse, even though that would grow. And in addition to that increased awareness and acceptance, you now have the death of a young 31-year-old man on hunger strike, and from the result of force feeding, which, as Maeve outlined really powerfully, as an image, carries incredible weight and incredible power. And I'll discuss how that was utilised across 1917. So first of all, just share the screen with you. Hopefully this works, because I'm like Maeve, I'm one of the novices as well. So I'm going to get going here. So here we go. And off we go. So I just want to talk about leading into the hunger strike in County Clare and how that evolved across the country. In May 1917, despite the fact they had the election of Count Plunkett,
Hi there. We just seem to have lost Tomás there. Helene, can I just pass over to you there while we see if we can get Tomás back up and running, okay? Thanks a million.
Thank you. Okay, just while we're waiting for Tomás, it might be a good point at which to ask maybe our first two contributors, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your video and, oh, hang on. Preemptive. Nope, not yet. So this is the joy of the contemporary conference. Okay.
Here, Helene.
Hi, Tomás. Sorry, Jean here, the moderator. Tomás, I think it might be best. Your bandwidth is low. Could you turn off your video, and also don't use your slides, and we might be able to proceed then.
No problem, I'll do that, Jack.
Okay.
Okay, so this paper presented by Tomás will be, I think, audio only, just to compensate for the very low bandwidth. Okay. Okay, we just hold on.
Okay, I think I'm back without video.
Okay, we don't have video, Tomás. We might just stick to the audio, just because you have quite a low bandwidth there. So the video is pretty much static. So would
That's
you
no problem. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Are you okay to stick with audio, Tomás?
Yeah, that's fine. No problem, Helene. I can work through that. That's fine. No problem.
Okay, I'll bow it again. So thanks.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm still on.
Yeah, we can hear you, Tomás. You can keep talking.
Okay, very good. All right. Listen, that's the joy, I suppose, as you say, of Zoom conferences. Look, I'm going to just keep going. Hopefully you're all hearing me all right. I mentioned the fact that in May 1917 in County Clare, despite the fact that there had been a gradual increase in terms of support for Sinn Féin, you have the county inspector making the following statement that the county is quiet. Yet in October of that year, he makes the following statement, in contrast, that Sinn Féin is the law of the land. So that is a huge contrast by anybody's measurement. And I suppose if you look just generally in terms of what happens in that period, you have the election of Eamon de Valera in July of that year, and it's really significant. It introduces de Valera to the political landscape. It also brings about some significant changes in terms of the attitudes outwardly of the volunteers, who up until that time had been working quietly and trying to mobilise and train and develop their brand. It was a fraught and violent campaign throughout. We know de Valera was successful, but what was really the big success for the volunteers was they saw what a public campaign, and even sometimes what a violent campaign could do for the general enthusiasm for the Republican movement. There was concerns that since the Easter Rising of 1916, there had been little activity to speak of to hold the public emotional solidarity that had emanated the Easter Rising. So the volunteers in Clare made the decision to initiate a 3-phase policy, the first of which was to drill in front of the RIC against the Defence of the Realms Act. They knew they'd be arrested as a consequence of that, and they anticipated that. The second phase of the policy was to refuse to recognise the court-martial. And the third phase was to demand political prisoner status, and when that would inevitably be denied, to hunger strike. And this was all initiated by volunteers in County Clare without approval of GHQ. And they only gave approval to it when eventually it got to the point in September and in Mountjoy where they couldn't stop it, and they felt that the only effective thing was to support it at that point. So the campaign began in Clare, got support from people like Tomás, Ash, Austin Stack, Sean Tracy, who, to be fair, didn't need an awful lot of encouragement to become more vocal about their participation, about their voicing of their feelings on the Republican position and campaign. But it moves us on quite quickly into Mountjoy Jail in the middle of September 1917, when 38 prisoners have been brought from different parts of the country, 16 from County Clare, by far the biggest representation of any county. You had a cohort that seemed incredibly determined to take the fight to the British authorities. And this is really important because we see for the first time really, I suppose, the parallel.
Okay, Tomás, you may or may not be able to hear me. Okay. I think at this stage we might just take a moment and ask Tomás perhaps if he could just wait. What we might do, if Niall Murray is actually there, we might move on to the next paper and come back to Tomás at the end, if that makes sense. Okay, Niall, are you there?
Hello, I'm still looking at my notes, but I'm glad to jump in if.
This is the joy of the new reality in the world of conferences. It's technical difficulties, unfortunately. Thank you, Tomás. Hopefully, we'll be able to come back to you maybe towards the end. And apologies for that to our listeners and watchers. So, for the moment, we might just move on to the final paper in today's panel. And the hunger strike, of course, of 1917 is very important in the history of hunger striking in the 20th century. But so too, of course, is the hunger strike in 1920 in Mountjoy. So Niall Murray from our own School of History and University College Cork will be presenting a paper called After the Strike, the Later Revolutionary Careers of Cork Participants in the 1920 Mountjoy Strike. So a short biography on Niall. He is a PhD candidate in the School of History, investigating aspects of the Irish Revolution through a micro-study of the Macroom district in County Cork. He is a PhD Excellence Scholar of UCC's College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences, and a contributor to the award-winning Atlas of the Irish Revolution. So Niall, thank you for last minute stepping up for us. I'm going to step out perhaps and just let you go on with your paper. Thank you.
Hi there, everybody. I'm here a little earlier than expected, so forgive me if I'm running over some notes that were still being scribbled out here. Thank you to everybody for tuning in, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation. I should, before I forget, acknowledge the support from my own PhD research from the UCC College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences. All these funding streams for PhD and other postdoctoral, etc. students is more vital than ever these days, so it's all gratefully received. Yeah, as I won't dilly-dally, as Elaine was saying, yes, my broader research at the moment is connected with the, I suppose, trying to examine the War of Independence and the broader Irish Revolution on the ground, not just the military, but the political side of things. And within that, I am examining the membership and the backgrounds of men and women who joined the fledgling Irish Republic's military campaign. And within that, I'm keen to see to what extent imprisonment more generally influenced the likelihood to which men, and it was mostly men, who would go on to take part in or continue to or accelerate their own participation in actual violent activity, engagement in armed conflict. This is an ongoing exercise, as I say, as part of my PhD project, supervised by Andy Bielenberg, Dr. Andy Bielenberg, and our good friend John Borganovo. I don't have any broad findings on that question yet to present at this stage, but this conference, I suppose, has given me the opportunity to add a new question or sub-question, that is to consider the impact of hunger strike participation in not just revolutionary activities, but specifically in acts of violence. So the small group that I have chosen to discuss here today, I'm just going to share my screen there. I'll get it going if I can. Bear with me, sorry. Press the share button. I think that's sharing now, and I went the wrong page, of course. Forgive me. Sorry, yes, excuse me. Yeah, so the small group I'm going to discuss here today are part of a larger cohort of men from County Cork who were arrested in the early months of 1920 and deported and interned in England, where these guys were detained in Wormwood Scrubs prison in London. Here they took part during April and early May of 1920 in a hunger strike that lasted in some cases up to 3 weeks. Some had taken part in other short-lived strikes at the same prison earlier on in April 1920. Now, as William Murphy has reasonably argued, the hunger strike at Wormwood and in the weeks beforehand at Mountjoy had significant effects themselves. They've mostly been described for their impact on the thinking of the British government towards the situation in Ireland. As Will Murphy has put it, more than 300 prisoners and interned men, most but not all of them in the IRA, had, I quote Will Murphy here, said, they humiliated cabinet members, hastened the reorganisation of British administration in Ireland, damaged the authority of the Irish and English prison systems, and undermined the morale of the army and police in Ireland. So that was some effect indeed. But I want to look today at the effect that the hunger strikes had on the men themselves and on the revolution in their own native places. For some, as identified in one case by Just Augustine of a South Derry IRA company captain, release on the expectation of authorities that they would later return to prison forced men to leave the area or even the country rather than face rearrest. In the area I am examining today, encompassing parts of the Cork IRA's number 1 and 3 brigades, that would be the Mid Cork and West Cork command areas. The historian Peter Hart has said that those who survived such hunger strikes went on to, quote, to form the backbone of the guerrilla effort in many areas, as at the Kilmichael ambush. Now, from the evidence of the small group I'm looking at today, that may well be true. Several of them did indeed go on to be fighting men. And one of them, men I consider here today, was among Tom Barry's column at Kilmichael and is one of several who were there who were in the Wormwood Scrubs hunger strike. What becomes evident also is another factor not often considered in the formation of the flying columns during the late months of 1920, is that among those men who had been in custody and on hunger strike earlier in 1920, particularly those in Wormwood, men such as these had been left in no doubt by the end of the year that the British change of prison policy and towards hunger strike specifically meant that they would not, their capture would not end in quick release if they did choose to hunger strike again. So I suppose that I'm just saying that it probably gave an extra incentive to those who had already experienced prison that, you know, they were definitely going to be guys going on the run because they knew what to expect having been in prison, albeit they were released on hunger strike, but they knew by the end of 1920 that hunger strike would no longer result in release. The humiliation suffered by the authorities earlier in the year in Wormwood and in Mountjoy were probably key to the determination of British authorities not to release MacSwiney from Brixton or to release others who began their hunger strikes in August 1920 in Cork jail in the days before MacSwiney. But if those earlier strikes were a humiliation to the men in cabinet, what then of the impact on men who took part? Hart rightly points out that they went home, I quote, more determined that their sacrifice would mean something. But let's look now at that sacrifice, and as he described it, and in the case of Wormwood at least, the actual suffering of the men involved. So the as detailed by Will Murphy in his monograph, of Irish political prisoners in the revolutionary decade, the Wormwood Scrubs prisoners were emboldened to take on a hunger strike by the success they had heard of from Dublin, where 90 of those who had been hunger striking in Mountjoy were released in the week before the Wormwood prisoners began their strike. It was not the first such strike in Wormwood, but the earlier one had petered out within a couple of days. The men released officially on parole from Mountjoy after 10 or 12 days had been ostensibly seeking treatment as prisoners of war. But when 2/3 of those held at Wormwood Scrubs followed suit, as internees rather than convicts, they were demanding instant and unconditional release. The 105 who began the strike on Wednesday, the 21st of April, hadn't all voted in favour of striking. At least 20 of those who began the strike had opposed the move initially. But the 105 did include the 6 men I'm going to focus on today. So forgive my cartography skills. Should have asked my friends on the Atlas team, but this is just showing the broad area that I'm talking about, from which the men I'm talking about today came. If you look at the top of the map there, you'll see Macroom. Bandon is down near the bottom centre. There's a distance of about 20 miles there between Macroom and Bandon, just to give you an idea of scale. Cork City is off to your east, up in the top right-hand corner. So the names are there in the on the left-hand side. Again, apologies for my colour coding. But the men involved, so they were aged between 22 and 29. Most of them at the older end of that age range. All 6 were senior figures already in their respective IRA companies. Most had been observed and reported to the military in the preceding years for illegal drilling with the Irish Volunteers, or were known to have been involved on raids on private farms and homes for weapons for use by the IRA. The 3 companies they were involved with, the map shows there, the yellow pins are for members of the Kilmurry Company, which is just north of the Green Line, which is the border between the Mid-Cork and West Cork IRA brigades. Well, a very rough representation of it. Again, I'm not a map maker. The area with the green dots, they're members of the Newcestown Company, which is in the Bandon Battalion, which is part of the West Cork Brigade. And down at the bottom there, which is the Mount Pleasant Company, again part of the Bandon Battalion in West Cork. So that's the home place of Frank Hurley, who, along with fellow members of Mount Pleasant and members of the Newcestown Company, had attacked the RIC barracks in Mount Pleasant at the end of February 1920. In Newcestown, IRA Captain John Allen, his first Lieutenant Dan Canty, and Second Lieutenant John Lorden had also taken part in that event, and along with 2 other Newcestown men were among those arrested by British military in the early days of March 1920. John Allen, but incidentally, was a former RIC constable. He had resigned a year or 2 earlier, saying he was wanted on the family farm, but described by the RIC, his old colleagues in early 1920, as a dangerous individual. He's also, by the way, the brother, for anybody who's familiar with the collections in the military archives, a brother of Brother William Allen, who was an assiduous collector of all things Irish revolutionary history. In Kilmurry, Patrick O'Leary was the company captain since 1917, described by police as influential and very active. And he and Denny Jimmy Long had both been involved for several years. Both took part in the Cork Brigade, the Cork Brigade of Irish Volunteers, Easter 1916 mobilisation. So although O'Leary had been involved in the attack by the IRA on Kilmurry RIC barracks in January, which was one of the 3 attacked in Cork that night, the first officially sanctioned IRA attacks with the approval of IRA headquarters in Dublin, the RIC mistakenly believed that his comrade in the Kilmurry Company, Denny Jimmy Long, had also been involved, whereas he had not. So now these are the gentlemen I'm talking about who were, as I say, they were held initially in Cork and then transported to London. So moving then to the Wormwood Strike itself, in a letter cited by Peter Hart from Kilbrittain man John O'Mahony during or just after the strike, O'Mahony described what happened in the jail, and it's a grim picture. He described being left in a solitary confinement for 3 days with a mattress, pillow and blanket so dirty, he wrote, that I had to tie a handkerchief around my face to keep the dirt off. And he described prison guards mocking him about dying in the cell. Frank Hurley, who I mentioned earlier, whose sister and local Conmara branch president Anna went on to marry the aforementioned John O'Mahony. Frank was also in the same hunger strike with his fellow mid-Cork arrestees. In a letter to his sister in Australia, days after his release, Hurley described how things were looking bad for the first few days of the strike when, as he put it, it looked as if the defenders of small nations were going to leave us to die. They tried every means to break the strike and break our health too, which is something important as I go on. It was over a week before any of the prisoners, other than those with bad hearts, as Hurley described them, were released. And among those first released into local hospitals were Dan Canty after 6 or 7 days, and Pat O'Leary after 10 or 11 days on the strike. As an aside, by the way, some of the conflicts that broke out within the prison were related to the fact that the prison authorities declined the requests to have the men who were turning unwell early on transferred either to the hospital infirmary or to external hospitals. But in fact, Home Office files suggest that this sounds rather something like a modern 21st century story, but basically bed management in the external hospitals wasn't what it should be. And despite appeals to various military hospitals where there were concerns obviously about mixing, as they call them, Sinn Féiners with army soldiers, and even attempts to secure the former home of the soap manufacturer, Mr. Pears, which had been used during the war as an army prison. It was over a week into the strike before any spaces were found outside the prison to accommodate hunger striking prisoners who had become unwell. The son of Dennis J. Long of Kilmurry, Connie Long, recently described how his father remembered the experience in a passage used in an exhibition recently at Independence Museum Kilmurry here in Cork. His father recalled internal tensions, something that William Murphy's chapter on the Mountjoy and Wormwood Hunger Strikes also talks about, which led to the prisoners going on what Long described as a rampage, when the men used books as wedges between the cell doors and the hinges to help knock the cell doors off their frames. This was following the refusal of prison authorities to leave the doors open at night to allow men keep watch over their fellow inmates who were getting weaker and weren't being transferred. Frank Hurley wrote of this situation, "From that out we got hell on earth. They tried everything but forcible feeding. They put the food in and we threw it out. Then they tried all kinds of threats and brutality, but we stood firm. Later, the stronger men were then put 3 to a cell and some were beaten. Connie Long says his father was put in a cellar and got a bad cold after lying on a mattress on the concrete floor. He was one of the last to be released after lasting 21 days without food before prison medics deemed them too weak to remain in Wormwood. But Dennis Long also described to his family what was either the noise of repairs to the door or the impact of the efforts of the prisoners to get the doors off their hinges. What Frank Hurley describes it as being to do with the doors being smashed by the prisoners, but both talked about basically the effects on some of the weaker prisoners of their mental health from all the commotion going on. Dennis Long had told his family that it nearly drove them mental. And Frank Hurley wrote to his sister in Australia that the slamming of the doors was the cannon shots to men with weak nerves. So I'm conscious that there's some work being done on the traumatic the impact on mental health and possibly related stresses on men and women of events during the revolution. But I suppose this brings to mind the need maybe to look at the impact on mental health of imprisonment and indeed hunger strike in this case. whether it was from a combination of the hunger strike or the conflict going on around them between prison staff and the other prisoners, as well as the effects of the strike. The prisoners claimed physical mistreatment by guards, some saying they had their teeth knocked in, and other assaults. The incident described in the press cutting in the slide you see there was investigated by prison authorities after the prison warder said that he had put in some food that wasn't being touched. The prisoners broke the glass in their cell door and threw it out. One of the prisoners ended up with a black eye, but the internal investigation believed the warder's account that he was acting in self-defense. So as I said, in stages between 1 week and 3 weeks after commencement of the strike, the men were all released. There were in total over 200 Irish prisoners. They included some who had been, for some reason, added to the numbers already there, who had been transported from Belfast, much to the prison authorities' disgust, who joined the strike. So all these men were, or the vast majority, were released over a 3-week period after over a 2-week period after being on for between a week and 3 weeks. Frank Hurley wrote to his sister on the day after release that the men were quite happy and were being fed gradually at the Highgate Hospital, which is one of 2 workhouse infirmaries where he and dozens of others stayed for over a fortnight, despite the impatience of the local board of guardians whose wards were being occupied. The photograph on actually both photographs there are from the Highgate and Cornwallis. These are men who had been held in the Highgate and Cornwallis infirmaries, which were both, as I say, local board of guardians, poor law workhouses. So I'm sure there was a lot of unhappy local representatives when the local poor were being left out of the kept out of the hospitals by recovering hunger strikers. As debate went on between Dáil representatives and British government officials on who should pay for the released men's return to Ireland, many of them were writing to the prison authorities looking for return of their clothes and belongings. So the strike in its, I suppose that's as much as I want to say on the strike itself, but just to point out that it was far from a peaceful protest, as demonstrated. Conflict between Irish inmates, numbering more than 200, and wardens had escalated within days of its commencement. And even if any of the physical alterations may be exaggerated, there is evidence of psychological torment and abuse being suffered, whether caused directly or indirectly by prison authorities or staff and their actions. But the camaraderie and the bonds formed between men in the prison strengthened further the networks that extended beyond the often strict territorialism that existed in many places over company, battalion and even brigade boundaries, not just in Cork but elsewhere across the country. One of the biggest difficult challenges for the IRA was that kind of Mayfainerism, where the local officers were very territorial over their own patch. The evidence from this small group's experience also suggests that Peter Hart was correct in his assertion that the hunger strike made the men of the Cork IRA even more determined to carry on the revolution when they got home. Frank Hurley wrote to his sister, "I'm sure we're in for hot times when we get back to Ireland," and he was quite correct. So after the strike, I want to look at some of the activities of the men I've been looking at there, and potentially the consequences in later life of those events in the prison. The men's release and their eventual return home to Cork actually coincided with the local elections of June 1920 to fill seats on rural district and county councils. Following the lead set in 1918, when men in English jails were nominated for Sinn Féin in Westminster elections, Sinn Féin put forward several of those in Wormwood for places on these councils. It mightn't quite have been a case of put him in to get him out. Most men had been released by the time the election took place, but 4 of the men I've been looking at here, as it happens, were returned to the Macroom and Bandon Rural District Councils. O'Leary and Long were elected to the Macroom Rural District Council, John Allen and John Lorden to the Bandon District Council. It's not clear how much business, if any, they took part in. I didn't get to see as many local government record files as I'd planned ahead of this, despite the great work of our archivists and archive staff to get things back open during the summer. Scheduling has been a difficulty for a lot of researchers as well, though. But it appears that Long and O'Leary, from what I can see, made few appearances at Macroom District Council meetings. It might be suggested that they didn't want to run the risk of capture after being on hunger strike, but some of their more senior officers in the IRA's Macroom Battalion were regular attendees at urban district council meetings, to which body to which they had been elected earlier in 1920, and they were even turning up to meetings into early 1921, at which stage they had been forced on the run through a combination of martial law across Munster and the wrath of auxiliaries who'd come to replace the company from Macroom who had been wiped out at Kilmichael. So it might be, and this is just a tentative idea, but that the experience of Wormwood Scrubs and the hunger strike had determined prisoners like Long and O'Leary, our ex-prisoners, to be even more careful than other men on the run about their movements and their risk of rearrest. Back in the West Cork Brigade, however, despite their marked man status, the homes of several returned Wormwood prisoners continued in use as meeting places and important centres for the handling and distribution of important communications. I note specifically the house of Frank Hurley from Mount Pleasant was raided after a senior RIC intelligence officer was shot and killed going to mass in Bandon in, I think it was July 1920. A raid on a neighbouring house led to a young carpenter, his sister later said, being given a bad mauling by soldiers. And the Hurley home would have been subject to reprisals and probably a burning by Crown forces in July 1920, had they not, while preparing to do so, captured the West Cork Brigade senior officers Tom Hales and Patrick Hart, who many of you may know were tortured while in custody. But Hurley's house was marked out by military, and he himself was a marked man as friendly soldiers, and Bandon told one of his farm workers that, I quote from a later account, that they said that if Frank Hurley were caught, he would be butchered. Hurley managed to evade capture for nearly a year, while the house continued in use by the West Cork Brigade. But he was caught himself in Bandon town on a raid for bicycles in May 1921. He was taken with other detainees to the grounds of Castle Bernard, where earlier in 1920 another volunteer who in custody had been taken and had been found dead. So possibly knowing this, Hurley tried to run off and escape, but was shot and killed. Liam Deasy attributed his attempt at escape to knowledge of the fate of an earlier volunteer, as I mentioned, or he might have been conscious of the torture endured by Hales and Hart while they were in custody, or indeed he might have been conscious of the fate of several volunteers from Cork executed in the previous couple of months. But another possibility is that his unsuccessful dash for freedom was the action of somebody suffering some form of mental debility after his experience in Wormwood. I can only make guesses, but it calls to mind the similar tragic end to the life of Richard Kent at North Cork in Castle Lyons, who we do know from earlier court records had suffered mental health issues prior to 1916, but he was shot and killed attempting to make an escape after he and his brothers surrendered to the RIC in the shootout there in May 1916. Moving to the three Newcestown men, they went on to become members of the West Cork Brigade Flying Column commanded by Tom Barry, and like Hurley, the home of John Lorden was singled out for particular attention by Crown forces, resulting in early 1921 of the assault of his sister and the burning of the family home during one of several raids there. In the meantime, Lorden had carved out a high reputation for himself among fellow IRA column members, described as one of the best men in Ireland by Tom Kelleher, a fellow veteran of the Flying Column's success at Crossbarry, where Tom Barry lauded Lorden for his fighting. Lorden had already been in another IRA success after apparently winning the toss of a coin with his fellow Newcestown man and Wormwood returnee Dan Canty for the chance to use their one available rifle to join Barry's column at Kilmichael in November 1920, where other Wormwood Hunger Strikers included John Flyer Nyhan, who was feeble but able to walk when he was removed to hospital after 10 or 11 days on hunger strike in Wormwood. Also there was Dennis O'Brien, another Newcestown man, and I think Stephen O'Neill from West Cork also, who was at Kilmichael and then in the hunger strike at Wormwood. Lorden at Kilmichael was in the section of the column that lost 3 men in the gun battle, and he himself lost a lot of blood when he was wounded. I also wanted to mention another incident in which Lorden took part, this time in his own patch back in October 1920, when word reached men gathered in his home of 2 lorries of British military arriving at the Newcestown village. They rushed to the scene where some brigade officers had already begun to engage the Essex Regiment. Although it might have been the correct thing to do when comrades were already in action, and although 2 British soldiers were killed, the description of the event by Liam Deasy in his book Towards Ireland Free is interesting. He wrote that Lorden took charge of local scouts armed only with shotguns rather than more effective rifles and ran to join the battle in the village. Deasy wrote, "There was no time for planning or positioning. Circumstances would have to be allowed to dictate the details of the action." It mightn't sound too unusual from numerous accounts of various IRA attacks around Cork and elsewhere, where largely opportunistic attempts were made to hit Crown forces entering unexpectedly in an area or with little or no prior notice. In this event, the consequences were not so grave, for the IRA at least. But in the next parish over, things didn't go so well 7 weeks earlier, when an abandoned ambush position was occupied at short notice and rather hurriedly by members of the Kilmurry IRA company on the 22nd of August. The consequences of the action at Lisarda were the death of Company Quartermaster Michael Galvin and the severe wounding of volunteer Daniel O'Leary, who had to give up his activities on the active service unit there. This action was under the command of Patrick O'Leary, who had been released 4 months earlier from Wormwood. Local historian Mary O'Mahony, who's just published an account of that ambush at Lisarda, says that word had been sent to Macroom battalion staff for approval to mount the ambush when it was learned that of an IRIC and auxiliaries lorry travelling between McBandon and Macroom through Lisarda. But the Kilmurry volunteers were already in place by the time sanction even arrived, or they may even have begun the ambush before that the scout reported back from more senior officers. So I suppose the point I'm making is that the contrasting outcomes to events at Newcestown and Lisarda demonstrate how the consequences of either side in the War of Independence often swung on tiny margins of such occasions. That's long been established. But the leadership shown in both cases, whether you might see it as wise initiative or rash, unstrategic military conduct, is interesting when considering that both Lorden and O'Leary had been on hunger strike less than 6 months earlier. And interesting also when considered this alongside the seemingly snap decision of their fellow Wormwood returned prisoner Frank Hurley to try and run for freedom from British custody near Bandon some months later. It'd be rash, of course, to try and reach a simple conclusion that this was all the effects of hunger strike, but I would suggest that maybe the past imprisonment or hunger strike participation of IRA figures be taken into account or probed more closely when we assess such military actions. And I'll be listening carefully to some of the later papers with a more medical and psychological take on the impacts of hunger strike. I do want to speak. I'm not sure how I am for time, Elaine. I have a minute or 2 left, I think, to go on the paper, but
what we'll do actually, Niall, maybe is just go for another couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes, and then Tomás is actually back to us. And
okay, yeah, that's great. I'm nearing the end here, and I just 1 or 2 other things to allude to. Great, thank you. I did want to, no, I didn't go into all the various activities. Most of the men were, as I say, on the run for the remainder of the War of Independence. I won't go into their Civil War participation, but or otherwise. But I did want to speak briefly about the, and I'm not, as I acknowledge, a medical specialist, but just some of the possible effects again of the hunger strike later on in the men. Many of them managed to survive the Irish Revolution. Patrick O'Leary and Denis Jamie Long. Patrick lived into their late 60s and early 70s, respectively. We do know, however, that Dennis J. Long from Kilmurry suffered ill health immediately after his return, although he was on the run to avoid rearrest and was on the Macroom Battalion and the Cork No. 1 Brigade flying columns in, for example, the Coolnacahara ambush near Ballyvourney in February 1921. In June 1923, Long having bowed out and not taken part in the Civil War, his local doctor certified to the Department of Defence in a claim for wounds or disability that, I quote from the certificate, after leaving jail in 1920, he suffered from general debility, and all along since that he has not been able to work. That's June 1923. A year later, local TD Thomas Nagel wrote to the Minister for Defence, again I quote, "This man was imprisoned in pre-truce days on hunger strike. He is still very ill as a result." Now obviously we have to take account of the fact that there was a compensation or a pension and the disability allowance being sought, but nonetheless there is evidence from a local dispensary doctor. All that aside, besides Frank Hurley, other Wormwood survivors did die young. John Allen was 63 when he died in 1954, but again, the cause of death is interesting. He died of colitis, which again, and acknowledging not being a medical expert, but certainly is related to the digestive system. I'm open to correction on that. Please, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong. But John Flyer Nyhan, who I mentioned earlier, who had been taking part in Kilmichael after Wormwood and who was very weak but barely able to walk when he was removed to hospital from Wormwood Scrubs. He died in his late 30s in 1934 of pneumonia and heart failure. Now, it could as well have been as much to do with his time on the run and the effects of being on the flying column, which is well documented in many other survivors. But again, it's just an interesting addition. Now, and in relation to John Lorden, although I haven't found a death register entry, it is recorded in one local publication that he died of a burst appendix in his late 30s, which brings to mind the death with appendicitis of prisoner Francis Gleeson shortly after his release from the 1920 Mountjoy Hunger Strike. As Will Murphy noted, the medical evidence there prompted a verdict that his death was accelerated by the effects of hunger strike. So to conclude, my takeaways from this very minor piece of research, and these are merely preliminary thoughts rather than anything definitive. If any such conclusions can ever be brought in Irish revolutionary history. But I would suggest two things that we should maybe examine more closely, whether as medical or revolutionary historians, the afterlives of hunger strikes for the possible effects, whether in the short term or the long term, on the physical or mental health of the men involved. And also that examinations of military episodes in both the War of Independence and the Civil War might do well to consider the possible contribution of any impacts of imprisonment and hunger strike on the attitudes, decisions and actions of men and women involved. We often hear about the potential impact of post-traumatic stress disorder by members of the British Ground Forces in Ireland, and the role of that in their actions, and it might equally be worth applying the same to some of those actions by Irishmen. Frank Hurley's thinking may have been rather wishful when he wrote to his sister in Australia on the 8th of May 1920 after his unconditional release from Wormwood that the victory is won and with God's help there will be no deaths. It was the greatest thing since Easter week. The Wormwood Scrubs Hunger Strike and those in other jails in 1920 have never quite received the same attention as Easter week, but hopefully the balance may slightly change on that question after this week's conference. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Niall, so much, not only for a really interesting paper, but also for jumping in slightly early. Much appreciated. Really good to have, obviously, in counterbalance to Heidrun's really interesting overview and Meadhbh's clinical detail about the horrific apparatus, to go then to stories of individual survivors and participants. So thank you. Okay, I think at this stage we actually have Tomás back on the line. Am I right in thinking that?
I hope so, Mia. I hope so, Helene.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry for so unfortunately interrupting you mid-flow of what was shaping up to be a very interesting paper. We actually have about 20 minutes left, Tomás, so without further ado, I'm going to step back and let you take up where you left off. Thank you.
Listen, I'm not going to try the presentation just in case that causes any difficulties, and I do hope obviously we can stay going. I don't need to take up the full 20 minutes because I'm conscious that there's time for questions as well. But in terms of where I left off when technology left us down, the Republicans who had taken an outward position with regard to their campaign and who had been imprisoned in Mountjoy in the middle of September 1917 were certainly in no mood for any type of amicable relationship with the prison authorities. So in the context broadly of the Mountjoy experience, and of course there's a lot of attention on the nature of force feeding, the brutality of it, that was part of the purpose of the campaign, I suppose, was to draw attention to what Republicans would see as British intransigence. But you encountered in September 1917 a group of men who were determined to bring the fight to the British authorities as symbolic and representative of British rule. And that's exactly how it played out. There were even confrontations between prisoners when the hunger strike element of the campaign was brought forward. And one prisoner, Dick Coleman, Richard de Coleman, who later died in Wales in 1919, he didn't agree on principle with hunger striking, and there was a confrontation between some clear Republicans, and Tracy, of all people, had to step in and try and, as he said, quash the effort, because he felt that Coleman had the right to step out of the hunger strike if he wanted to. So there was a determination to bring the campaign inside the walls of Mountjoy Jail and to draw attention to British rule in that way. In terms of the experience, there's an escalation of tension almost immediately. By the 19th of September, it had gone to the point where John Boland, the Deputy Governor of Mountjoy Jail, made the decision, and it turned out to be a really significant decision, to send his warders into the cells to remove beds, bedding, clothes, bedclothes, etc. from the cells of the prisoners, who had smashed up the prison cells and had broken the windows significantly. So for over 2 days, from the 20th of September, when at 10 a.m. the hunger strike began, for the first 2 days of that, all of the prisoners were in cold stone cells with open windows, with no clothes and no bedclothes. And that, as an image, was significant, and that was communicated out to the general public. But obviously, from a medical point of view, it would weaken individuals, certainly, who were beginning a hunger strike. And also when forcible feeding began. Forcible feeding began 2 days after the hunger strike, so on the 22nd of September 1917. I spoke to the son of one of the hunger strikers, and it's interesting in the context of what Meadhbh has said and what Niall has said as well, that he used to remember his father shuddering, physically shuddering, every time the hunger strike would be discussed. And it would be rare, but certainly there was a consistent to that there was a physical reaction in his father's body when he would speak about the force feeding and the hunger strike in general and the death of Tomás Ashe. So I think the contribution from Meadhbh was really important to illustrate really in a raw way the nature of the force feeding, because it was physically traumatic, it was mentally traumatic, but it was really critical from the point of view of the image it created and the way in which that image was projected out to the general public. Because remember, this is a battle for the narrative. You know, this hunger strike, the whole campaign, is very much a battle for the narrative, and the reporting of what's happening, the communication of that to the general public, and the relationship between the inside movement and the outside movement is always critical in any hunger strike, and it certainly was in 1917. So 3 days into the force feeding, on the 25th of September, Tomás Ashe is fed for the 5th time, only the 5th time during that period. They were fed twice a day, and in his 5th feeding he became very weak. We know now that he went into heart failure. He was taken back to his cell, was found in a weakened condition later, and taken then to the Meadhbh hospital, where, as we know, at 10 p.m. he died after having a second heart attack. And that's really, really significant. I mean, there's obviously a world that we could go into in exploring that moment. You know, it's worth mentioning in terms of medical reports and in terms of the I suppose, attitudes of the prison authorities, that Raymond Dowdall, the chief medical officer in the prison, wrote in a medical report that I got in the, coincidentally, Brother Allen collection, Brother Allen, who was mentioned by Niall, that when he was asked the question, was his death and in any way the result of his confinement or his experience in prison, and he wrote no. So there was an awareness, I think, of the significance right from the moment of death on behalf of the British authorities. There was equally an awareness from the point of view of the Republican movement. And, you know, I really want, I suppose, to emphasize the significance of that moment in Irish history. I mentioned at the start way back when, that you know, I think that moment and the reaction to it, the martyrdom of Ash, the nature of his funeral, is as significant, or maybe more significant, in terms of its impact on the political consciousness of the Irish people. And this, you know, in a way was recognised at the time. You know, some of the press, like the Freeman's Journal and others, commented on the significance of it. They commented, you know, that 100,000 constitutional nationalists have now become 100,000 Sinn Féiners. Now, whether that's numerically true or not, there's certainly a revelation in there about, you know, how significant this moment was. And it's important to note, and I'm sure it'll be discussed as the conference proceeds in the next couple of days, that the death of a hunger striker is unlike any other death in terms of its impact. It has both this really powerful immediate impact, but also has this enduring quality. And I think, you know, through many of the hunger strikers, particularly MacSwiney, Ash, and later Bobby Sands, and others, you know, even in the 40s, there is a quality to the way that they died that has this endurance that maybe other figures within the revolutionary story don't have. But certainly at the time, it was accepted and acknowledged within the Republican movement that this was such a significant moment. Now, it was only that if they could communicate it to the public. Of course, messages were coming from the prison all the time about the experience of force feeding. Of course, the death of Ash is significant at an immediate level. 5 days after that Ash's death, on the 30th, on the same day that he's buried, the September rules, as they were called, were released to the public, wherein essentially the British authorities conceded the demands that the prisoners had put in place before the hunger strike began. And that was a significant moment. As Michael Brennan, Micheál Brennan, later Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the hunger strikers from Clare, said afterwards that, you know, there was a contest as to whether they were actually the demands or something approximate to the demands, or ameliorations as the British authorities described them. But certainly he said that none of the details mattered. You know, what mattered was in the public eye we had won, and it was bound to have a terrific effect across the country. And that's really, really significant, because there's only really, in terms of that battle for the narrative that I mentioned, there's only really three outcomes to any hunger strike. You know, there's concession by the authorities to the demands of the prisoners, there's surrender by the prisoners, or there's death. They're the only three outcomes in terms of that public interpretation of a hunger strike. And in the context of Ash's death, very swiftly and quickly, that became the focus of attention, much more so than the fact that the prisoners had gotten their demands, and that on the 30th they had been effectively, they had ended the hunger strike as a success from their campaign. The funeral is absolutely critical, and it had been in terms of the Irish culture, you know, funerary tradition. The whole symbolism around funerals has always been a really important part of the Irish psyche. And, you know, it's important as well to mention the whole relationship between hunger striking in ancient Ireland, as well as, you know, the Catholic tradition of sacrifice, all plays out. It's difficult to measure how much of an impact those elements have, but they certainly play out in a sort of an intangible way of bringing a force to the impact of the hunger strike, and importantly the death on a hunger strike, because I mentioned at the very start that there is an effectiveness to hunger striking as a way of confronting the authorities you're faced with, but the death on a hunger strike is something entirely different in terms of the influence and the weight that it carries. The Republican movement showed tremendous ability in terms of the way that they organised the funeral, and it was really, really critical. And this would be a fantastic template for the Fitzgerald experience, for the MacSwiney experience, and for Murphy, I suppose most particularly MacSwiney. But the funeral presented between 20 and 30,000 people marching in explicit solidarity with the Republican movement through one of what was technically at the time one of Britain's key capital cities in Dublin. And that's massively significant as an image, because, you know, a couple of months previously men were being arrested in small numbers for, you know, military drilling in small roads in Tipperary, Limerick and Clare and Galway, etc. But now, you know, there is this, you know, coming together of almost 30,000 people from various different bodies, trade unions, Postmen's Federation, fire brigades, hurling clubs, athletic clubs, Irish volunteers, 9,000 uniformed Irish volunteers, Irish national volunteers led by Colonel Maurice Moore, Citizen Army. There's a whole coming together of various representative bodies in, as I said, explicit solidarity with the Republican movement. Now that's a massively significant image in terms of the confidence it gives, and brings forward that gradual coming to the public surface of Republican campaigning, because it's very soon or very recent to pre-1916 when, you know, to express Republican separatism openly was enough to have you arrested. Now you have up on 30,000 people marching through Dublin City. The Republican movement organised it tremendously well, but they amplified the effect by organising Lewis and Whitten filmmakers to capture video footage of the funeral. And even on the night that Ash lay in state, on the Saturday before his funeral, they captured footage of that, and it was played in the Rotunda Cinema that night, on the Saturday night before the funeral. On the Sunday evening after the funeral, in the Bohemian Theatre in Phibsborough, the funeral of Tomás Ash was played to 1,000 people who sat there. And it was played throughout the country in various cinemas, and cinemas were becoming more popular at the time. So that was projecting that image of the funeral of Tomás Ash, the solidarity, the role in the clergy, of the clergy in the funeral, all giving confidence to those people who might have been reluctant to publicly declare their support for separatism, for Sinn Féin, or for the Republican movement in general. So this is massively significant. It takes the idea of a Republican funeral to a new level. Of course, the Ash one is going to be the most significant. There had been previous ones, like, you know, Padraig Courtney, you had Corky Walsh, William Partridge, across 1917, in smaller ways played a significant role. But certainly that Ash experience, the projection of the image, it's one of these sort of unchallengeable images because of the culture around funerals, but in terms of the way in which it has this force that cannot be contested, certainly by the British authorities. So you have a scenario where you have the funeral, you have that experience, you have the coming together of, you know, the hero and the martyr, the very deliberate presentation of Tomás Ash as a martyr. A lot of things come together, and Sean O'Casey, who was his friend, wrote a booklet about him. Markievicz wrote a poem, Heroes and Martyrs, and importantly it came together with his own penning of Let Me Carry Your Cross for Ireland, Lord. So there was a definite projection of Tomás Ash as a martyr, and that carried tremendous weight in terms of its influence on Irish public opinion across certainly the following decades. And importantly, to conclude, with the Terence MacSwiney experience and the support within the Republican movement for hunger striking to the end. Now, of course, there's a difference, because Ash's experience is intense. Force feeding is an important part of it. So it's a short, raw experience, whereas MacSwiney's and others, maybe as a consequence of that, is this long drawn out affair. But certainly the Republican movement were fully aware leading into 1920 of the very real significance and power in the death of a hunger striker, as well as the power of a hunger strike itself. So eventually, an hour and a half later, I got there, and thanks for your patience. And Helena, as chair, thank you very much for your support.
Thank you, Tomás. Can I just say it was a very interesting paper, worth waiting for, despite the technical difficulties. Okay, that's certainly food for thought from each of our four first panelists in panel A, Force Feeding and Hunger Strike Precedents. You might have noticed there, I'm not sure, actually, again, not being massively au fait with Zoom, you may or may not have seen the fact that there is a series of different questions and comments that have been coming up on the chat as each of our four speakers have been presenting their papers. So what we might do now is just to give ourselves enough time, because it's 5 minutes to 3 o'clock now. The next paper begins at 3:10. So there is actually a break scheduled just for the 10 minutes between the end of this panel and the start of the next one. But what we might do is we might just continue on with a couple of questions, bringing us up to 3:10. Obviously, anyone who would like to take, except for our four speakers, anyone who would like to take a break, do so now, because the questions will just be going on in the interim. Okay, so could I ask maybe our speakers to unmute and put on their videos again, just so we can work in sort of a panel situation. Hello again. Do we have a Heidrun there? And maybe, is Maeve still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Brilliant, hi Maeve. Have we lost Heidrun?
Sorry?
Yay, okay, so we have Heidrun as well. Thank you all. Again, just thank you for opening our conference so beautifully with those 4 papers. I'm just going to refer to some of the questions and pose them to, if they're intended for a particular speaker, I'll pose it to that speaker, and if not, maybe I can just ask anyone who would like to comment. So this kind of starting around the top, around Heidrun's paper, there's a comment here from actually, when John Borgonova was asking me to do the chat afterwards, he said to channel Joe Duffy. So just to begin the question, his name, and then maybe the question itself. So the first question here, I think it's posed to Heidrun, from Just. He says, I recognize the trap that women hunger strikers fell in as being used as weak women who were suffering rather than heroic people who endured pain and suffering. But did they really not have agency in this themselves? Who decides on portraying their strike in this way? So I don't know, Heidrun, would you like to address that question?
Yes, I would like to. At first, the suffragists themselves presented themselves as weak women and were strapped to the feeding chair. It's also, if you go through that newspaper, Votes for Women, for example, you find all these descriptions of their experience of forcible feeding. But also the pictures of forcible feeding and this, that they are only weak women strapped to a chair. That's what you would normally see. And I would say that as a woman, it's not really, you don't want to be a victim. Nobody wants to be the victim. And especially, I don't know if you women want to be strapped to a chair, or if you think that's really an inspiring role model. And I said of course they have some form of agency, because playing the victim is a form of manipulative strategy, and also you can induce other people to act as your guardian, for example. That's what they did, the suffragettes. For example, they induced the medical office to act as the guardians. That's why, for example, female hunger strikers were better treated in general than male hunger strikers. So they got more attention and better medical treatment in general than male hunger strikers. Because of this relation between female hunger striker and male medical officer. And often these medical officers also acted as their guardians.
Okay.
But I would say in general that they were victims, but we would use the term victim. And the male hunger strikers were more like, not victims, but more like sacrifice is a correct word.
Okay. So very much involved in their own representation as such. Thank you. Actually, there's another one here from E. Malloy, I think also mentioned or referring to your own paper, Heidrun. So while you're here, you might maybe address this also. She was very interested on the reference or the use of Nietzsche in your paper. She feels there's not enough attention being paid to his influence on the revolutionary generation. And she thought maybe you'd like to comment further on that.
I have chosen Nietzsche because he's actually quite important, and he also addresses some questions related to the hunger strike. For example, these that normally suicide is considered a form of nihilism because it doesn't make sense. You can't really make sense of suicide. Well, that's the problem, I would say, in Western societies or in general, that suicide doesn't normally make sense. But this has also been this entire debate, is this a form of suicide or not? And also in the Catholic Church, because normally So it's also a really delicate issue. But I think, so Nietzsche is quite interesting because he addresses a few questions related to the hunger strike, and especially because Nietzsche is quite important because Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers who addressed the importance of bodily practice or entire practice in general. Because normally you have this idea as only has agency or an impact on history or makes history, but Nietzsche is one of the first person who addresses this problem with the importance of practices and also that's actually quite important, one of the first philosophers.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bring up an interesting question as well there, Heidrun, and you talked, I think in your paper about that triad of, you know, Catholicism, republicanism, masculinity. Maybe I could ask any of the panelists to jump in here. In Catholic Ireland of sort of the early 20th century, how did this idea of the hunger strike reconcile with that Catholicism and this question of suicide? Did any of you come across anything around that in your research?
I might just very briefly comment because I'm sure the other lads have something as well, Helena. But I've seen that discussion a lot, particularly around, you know, the ethics of hunger striking and, you know, the collision with the commandments, etc. And, you know, I'm not sure really if that was as much of an issue for the ordinary man and woman in Ireland. You know, you had theological debates that took place around the nature of suicide versus a hunger strike, etc., and they continued. But for the general public, when you had a public meeting and you had 30 to 40 clergy, be they curates or parish priests, on a platform, you know, that's where they measured the kind of general solidarity with the Republican movement. So I'm not altogether sure, and of course there needs to be, you know, much more research. I did look into the ethics of it, and the discussions are really interesting. But at a general level, I'm not altogether sure those theological discussions bore out or certainly trumped the kind of emotional impact of force feeding, of death on a hunger strike. I really don't.
That's really a separation of philosophy. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tomás. Niall, I'm just looking at a question here as well that came in around the point where you were delivering your paper. And again, it's from Juiced, and he talks about the fact that it's, yes, obviously you were talking about individual personalities and individual experiences of hunger strike and the aftermath. But he makes the comment here that it's important to examine the hunger strike as one of many aspects of radicalization around this period. And really you'd have to, you know, compare the experience of men who went on hunger strike with those who didn't go on hunger strike in order to sort of to gauge the extent to which of the role that hunger striking made in radicalization of men during this period. Would you care to address that comment?
No, absolutely. I agree. Thanks, Yus, for the question. I would agree. I'm feeling a bit of, maybe like the British Cabinet, a bit of remorse for some early release of what is, I suppose, is very early, just some very early thinking and I suppose preliminary attempt to examine this question. But I think I mentioned at the outset there that yes, within the broader work on my PhD project, I'm looking among many factors in radicalization, etc. I'm using the IRA membership files from the military service pension collections and focusing on 2 battalion areas. But within that, under various categories, including family background and some of the other involvement in cultural nationalism questions that have been addressed by previous work like Euston and others. But I'm one of the categories that I'm interested in and I'm keeping track on is the activities of men who were in prison, and now adding the question of whether they had been on a hunger strike and trying to see if there's any pattern as to whether they were more likely to be men of violence or men who actually went to the flying column. I suppose there's the implicit thing as understood that the men who'd been in prison were more likely to be on the flying column by virtue of the fact that they were better known and more likely to be arrested. So that is certainly part of the broader question that needs to be examined, as you suggest. There is some initial kind of thoughts on what I've been looking at so far suggest that, you know, some of the some of the officers in the Macroom area IRA battalion, which would have been of representative of about 9 or 10 parishes, but that one of the youngest officers was only 17 or 18 when he was made quartermaster, and that was towards the end of 1920. And my thinking is that it was largely to do with the fact that he'd already had several short terms in prison, and because the battalion officers needed to be get out of town after Kilmichael and martial law had kicked in, that it may have been more a convenience than necessarily a decision that he was a strong officer material. Not saying that he wasn't, but again, yeah. So those are considerations. And as Youth's question, I was looking at it there, rightly suggests, that it needs to be a more holistic approach to consider a much bigger sample, which is part of what I intend to do. But I suppose the point of today's paper was just, as I said, to raise the question as to whether it's a factor that should be, I would suggest it is a factor that should be considered. But hopefully I'll be back with some more findings on that question at a later date.
Thank you. I know that Heidrun in her paper, and also Maeve in hers, looked at the experience of women, obviously, in hunger strikes prior to the revolutionary period that we're talking about in Niall and Tomás's paper. So there is a comment here about you're concentrating very much on the men, but there are also some women who went on hunger strike and should be acknowledged, including Annie and Mary MacSwiney, as we were saying, or Mary MacSwiney later on. So, Niall, would I be right in thinking, and Tomás, that really during this period, women weren't engaging in hunger strike? It was the Civil War period where we see women engaging in hunger strike again. I don't know if you'd like to comment on the emphasis on men in your papers.
Yeah, that would be my understanding. Again, yeah, certainly. I don't think there's any doubt of the importance of and particularly the Civil War hunger striking of women, not just the MacSwiney's, but many other women who took part in the Civil War hunger strikes. I suppose one aspect that unfortunately dropped off the end of my when the editing phase of my paper was to emphasize, though, while they didn't participate, I suppose another impact, I should have mentioned in my conclusion, but one of the impacts of the hunger strikes was that, again, along with other men in the flying column, but by virtue of the fact that they appeared to be more sought after by the Crown forces after their release, and therefore on the run, it was often the siblings, partners, mothers of the men who'd been in prison and on hunger strike who suffered the consequences. Anyone who saw the recent Cogar and Renault documentary on TG Carr will see, the evidence of, on all sides of the conflict, the impact of violence against women who are alone in the home, and the reason very often they were alone in the home was because men were on the run, men who had been on hunger strike or in prison. So I suppose that is another factor. And my apologies, I should have made a better effort to include that, because it was striking me as I was going along, that the women were left to, although again, and it was interesting whether the women had agency to decide on these things or not. It did occur to me, as I mentioned, I did allude to the fact that some of the houses of the men who'd been in prison and who were on the run continued to operate as call centres, as meeting places by senior brigade staff, knowing that they were occupied and they were essentially run. Some of them were IRA officers in their own right, but they were run by women, siblings or partners or independent women who were putting themselves at risk. Whether they had a choice or not is another question. But I suppose it was perhaps an unintended consequence of the men's imprisonment and their hunger strike, and the fact that they were more sought after, that it had this impact on the women's lives and their participation in the revolution more broadly.
Women were absolutely involved all fronts during that period. Actually, Maeve, on that note, you pointed to the very poignant lines in Annie MacSwiney's diary, which, as you were saying, is housed up there in the archives. So could you give us a little bit more detail just in terms of going through that as representative of, or giving an insight into the extent to which sort of the women on, in this case, I suppose, more the sidelines, watching somebody that they loved being on hunger strike and the impact that had on her?
Yeah, like it's an amazing document, because it basically details nearly hour by hour what happened with the women, particularly his sisters and his wife, while he was lying on hunger strike. So in one way, it's like he's in a room, you don't see him, you only hear comment on him, but you see and you hear what's happening to the women. And like, for example, for I think it was the last 2 days, his sisters weren't even allowed into the jail. Where before that, they had been allowed in to sit beside him. And when the nurse or the doctor came in, they'd stand in the corridor. They would never leave him too far, you know. But in this, they're then barred from going into the jail. They wait outside in the pouring rain and all this kind of stuff. And it's, I suppose it's just, even the prisoners, even the prison guards question why they're there and, you know, trying to get them to move on. And then they are very, like, violently manhandled when they're sitting beside his coffin when they're trying to bring it back to Ireland. So, like, I agree with Niall, you know, sometimes the focus can be on, like, Terence, MacSwiney, Lord Mayor of Cork, and the consequence of that is then felt by his sisters and his wife a lot. But it's nearly like it was if that was just, it was what they were doing and they just got on with it, kind of thing, you know. Like, it was, I listened to a RT documentary on one documentary there recently about the Wallace sisters in Cork. And like, I had never heard about these sisters, and listening to it, I was amazed, because how would we not have heard about them, considering what they did was on level, if not above, what a lot of the guys are doing. But like that, it was like, you just got on with it. You know, this is where people came, and like that, they fed lads that were on the run. So there's that kind of whole, it was done silently, but I think the evidence is there, and I think it's probably now in things like this, you know, that you can start bringing it out, because it was written by them, especially the sisters. Like, it is such a good diary, and I think it's switched on later tomorrow or today. And like, it's amazing, because there is a lot of violence against them, but the focus isn't on them, you know. So I think that's where maybe we should have a look at that, like the silent voices in the women.
As you're saying, it's conferences like this, during centenary events like this, that hopefully some of these more silent participants can be highlighted. Yeah, I hate to bring this to an end. I'm looking at the clock, and it's 13 minutes past 3, so we're 3 minutes over. John will kill me. Can I thank you all again, most sincerely, for overcoming technical difficulties and opening our conference so beautifully. Thank you all, and I hope that the participants enjoyed it. I'm sorry for not getting to all of the questions. I wish we had more time, but thank you. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks to all our speakers. That was great, Pam.